Hey everybody, welcome to another Instant Take from yours truly, Will Ashton. Yeah, so last week I hadn't had a chance to talk about it until now, but I got a chance to attend a screening of an Amazon Prime produced and distributed sequel called Another Simple Favor. This is, of course, a follow-up to the Paul Feig 2018, I believe, film of Simple Favor, which also starred Anna Kendrick and Blake Lively. It was I would say, a pretty modest little hit. I think it grossed about a little under $100 million for a budget that was, I think, around like 20 or 30 million. It was somewhere in the lower end of mid-budget. And yeah, it was like a little splashy, fun, twisty cocktail of a movie. It was kind of like a light, it was somewhere in between Gone Girl and Where'd You Go, Bernadette, not only in terms of story, but in quality. It had the, kind of intrigue and mystery and murder of Gone Girl, but also had kind of like the suburban mom, like this kind of element of suburbia and mystery that came with Where'd You Go, Bernadette. And, I think I was maybe a little bit more negative compared to John. I think John was the one who reviewed it on the podcast back when, because I don't think I saw it until it was on DVD. But it was a charming little movie. I'm not the biggest fan of Paul Feig as a filmmaker, but I think that kind of suited him a little bit better, not only because it was a little bit more tightly wound as a story, it had a chance to be, like a little under 2 hours. It was constrained to mostly a kind of plot-driven story. It didn't feel like he had to be improving his way through overextended scenes as much. It felt like a nice balance. It had all these characters in very, lovely suits and well-dressed buildings and, these lavish cocktails and martinis. And I think the big thing about that movie, more than anything else, was Blake Lively and her performance, which I think really was what made that movie work as well, as it did for a lot of people. Yeah, it was just a really fun, varied, multifaceted, sexy performance that I think proves to still be one of her best, at least that I can recall off the top of my head. And so when it came to the idea of doing a sequel, it didn't really feel like a natural conclusion, but, I think the idea of returning to that character and kind of catching up with Emily as her character, I believe, was named, was at least an appealing prospect in a modest sense. And I know that the first movie was based on a book that I believe was written by Darcy Bell. This one doesn't have any source material it's going off of, but it does have Paul Feig returning to direct it and screenwriter Jessica Sarzer, I believe it's coming back to write the screenplay, along with Leda Kalogridis, who I think most notably wrote the screenplay for Shutter Island, among other films. So, yeah, this movie, it wasn't really on my radar. I kind of kept forgetting it was coming out until it premiered at South by Southwest, where it got, decent reviews. I think more good than bad. But it didn't seem like the vibe was particularly, overwhelmingly positive or negative. It just kind of seemed like the people who liked it, and the people who didn't like it. And so I kept my expectations in check and kind of just hoped for something appealingly mild, because I knew this was mostly going to be seen on the small screen. I was going to be among the rare people who saw it on the big screen for the screening. And even with my expectations kept in check, I found myself, unfortunately, a little underwhelmed by this one. And I think it just kind of comes down to the fact that this isn't really based on any specific source material. That's not to say that this movie, kind of falls into the Feig formula of, characters, riffing over, extended sequences of foul language, but it does veer into that more than I think the first movie does. I think the biggest factor that kind of comes down to Anna Kendrick's character, who in the first movie was a little mousy, a little bit more kind of withdrawn, and her arc was more about her kind of becoming more confident in herself and kind of more willing to stand up for herself and to not apologize and all that. And so it makes sense for this movie to have her be a little bit more outspoken, a little bit more coarse, but it doesn't really seem like the movie knows how to evolve her beyond that. It just kind of seems like, okay, it's kind of fun to see her, stand more toe-to-toe with Blake Lively when she comes back into the fold. And the way that, I'm going to give a mouth spoiler, I guess, for the first movie, which I assume if you're listening to this, you have seen. But fair warning, I guess, ahead of time. The first movie ended with Blake Lively's character in jail, and this movie has to kind of come up with a fairly convoluted at best way of figuring out how that works. You really have to go with it if you're gonna try to apply logic to it. You're not gonna have a good time. But in that case, when it comes to like that kind of frenemy vibe between Lively and Kendrick, it is appealing, and I think it does kind of allow the first, I'll say, like 30 minutes to kind of coast by in a way that you're like, okay, it's not going to be the first movie, and that's fine, but it's a little amiable, and it's slight, like I said before, but it has a small kind of withdrawn charm. But then, similar to the first movie, Blake Lively kind of has to disappear for large sections of the film, and like I said, I think the fact that having Kendrick's character not be as well defined, not as structured, or as interesting or amusing, and then this movie just kind of makes this whole thing a little bit more of a slog. And I'm not trying to discredit Kendrick's performance. I think she does, as well as she could with this. It just doesn't seem like the writers have as much for her to do here, and it just doesn't seem like a particularly inspired take on her character based on the writing. As far as the other components of the film go, Lively is still fun. I don't think it's quite as on par with the first performance that she gave in the original film, but it's still inspired. I still think it's good work from her, and the way that it becomes more varied without getting into details as it goes along is kind of a nice inverse in some ways to what we see in the first movie. I'm trying to be as coy as possible about that. I don't want to give anything away to anyone that might be interested to see the film. But yeah, I don't know. I think the second half of this movie, as I've seen a lot of people comment on this, and I have to agree, it really does kind of go off the rails in a way that, that first movie, I think, has a deliberate kind of balance between being silly in like a good and bad way. And then this movie just kind of gets silly in a bad way, unfortunately. I kept thinking throughout this that it seemed like it was trying to emulate White Lotus, because the movie, as I didn't get around to mentioning earlier, is primarily set in Capri, Italy, for this sort of destination wedding that goes awry. And it has all these sort of, like elements from the first movie, the mystery, the mystique, the cocktails, the drama and all that. And I think, having seen 2 seasons of White Lotus, I still need to watch the third one. I just found myself wishing I was watching that third season instead of this movie, which would be an easier option if I wasn't in the theater. I could just pop on Max and throw the new season on. Alas, this movie, in addition to that show, also kind of reminded me, in a weird sort of way, of a film I can't imagine a lot of people think about all that much nowadays, which is The Whole 10 Yards, which is another film that, was a sequel to a kind of surprise hit, an ensemble film in some respects. That was also like a crime, dark comedy where, like these sort of mild-mannered suburbanite characters have to interact with these criminal characters. And in that first movie, it's not not flawless, but it does have the appeal of the cast, and I think there's enough sharp, funny material in there to make it work. And then the second movie, it just seemed like the big battle was just getting everyone back on board, but they didn't figure out what to do with those characters. And while this movie fares a little bit better than that one, it does have a similar kind of thing where it's like the fact they got the whole cast together to do another film kind of felt like they were hoping it would come together in a similar fashion, and I just can't really say that it does, unfortunately. I think this movie just, it's not as funny, it's not as entertaining, it's not as sharp or witty as the original film. And like I said, I'm not even the biggest fan of that original film, but I can at least see the strengths of it. And I feel like this movie, if you're a fan of the first movie, I could see you being disappointed. Maybe because it's going to be an Amazon Prime exclusive, audiences will be a little bit more forgiving than I am. If you are a big fan of that original movie, I hope you like it. I mean, it's not without its charms. There's one scene that I remember enjoying in particular involving some truth serum that I think kind of shows what like a campier, kind of more cheeky version of this film maybe could have been if it either leaned more into silliness or less. I don't know which would be better. But in any case, yeah, that's all I really have to say about it. I think that's plenty as it is. If you're listening to this, you're probably already able to watch it if you haven't already on streaming. I'm doing this one a little bit late, and John will probably get it on the feed a little bit late as well. But I figured I have a little bit of time before I go to see a movie. later this evening, I figured I was just going to do a little quick recording about it, and yeah, just kind of usher out my thoughts. I also have a written review that's going to be on In Between Drafts, if it's not on there already by the time you're listening to this. So that's all I really have to say. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you for listening, and yeah, have a good day. Bye.